China looked at its most important river and made a decision so extreme, so expensive, and so difficult that most countries would never have attempted it. And what happened next genuinely surprised the scientists who designed the whole thing. The Yangtze River is the longest river in Asia, over 3,800 miles of moving water cutting across China, feeding hundreds of millions of people for thousands of years. Fish once filled it so densely that locals had a saying that you could almost walk across the water on their backs. That was not an exaggeration. It was a memory. Because by the early 2000s, something had gone deeply wrong. Scientists measuring fish populations started seeing numbers that simply did not add up. Species counts had dropped to less than a quarter of what they once were. Animals that had lived in this river for over 100 million years were barely registering in surveys. The Chinese sturgeon, a fish that survived the age of the dinosaurs, was being counted in the dozens, not thousands, dozens. And one word started appearing in scientific papers that nobody wanted to see: ecologically dead. So how did a river this massive, this ancient, this central to an entire civilization get emptied out? At its peak, there were over 230,000 fishing families living and working along the Yangtze, more than 111,000 boats on the water. These were not weekend hobbyists. These were generations of families whose whole identity was built around the river. But over decades, the technology got better, the pressure got heavier, and the fish simply could not reproduce fast enough to replace the ones being taken. A single modern fishing vessel could catch in one day what a traditional boat once caught in an entire month. And there were tens of thousands of them operating every single day. At the same time, factories were draining chemicals into the water. Massive dams were cutting off migration routes that fish had used for millions of years to swim upstream and breed. The fish were being hit from every angle at once. They could not eat, they could not migrate, they could not reproduce, and the generations that would have replaced them never got the chance to exist. Then came the floods. Without enough fish and root systems holding the riverbed ecosystem together, the Yangtze started flooding more severely and more often. Cities downstream paid the price. Farmland was swallowed. The river that had given so much was starting to take it all back. So in January 2021, China did something that shocked the entire world. They banned all commercial fishing on the Yangtze River, not for a season, not for a year, for 10 full years. Every single one of those 111,000 boats was pulled from the water. Docks that had hummed with activity for generations went quiet overnight. But here is the part most people do not know. The fishermen were not simply pushed out and forgotten. The government stepped in with financial payments to replace their lost income. Job training was offered. New careers in other industries were made available. And in one of the most remarkable decisions of the entire program, many of those same fishermen were hired as river monitors, paid by the government to protect the very fish they once spent their lives catching. The same hands that had cast nets across the Yangtze for decades were now holding scientific monitoring equipment and reporting fish sightings to researchers. The people who knew the river better than anyone became its most dedicated guardians. But stopping the damage was never going to be enough on its own. The river had been emptied over 50 years. If you simply removed the boats and walked away, natural recovery would take generations, maybe longer. The population structures within fish species had completely collapsed. There were not enough adult breeding fish left to rebuild at any meaningful speed. So China decided to give nature a push. And when I say a push, I mean 1.3 billion fish released back into the river. Let that number sit for a second. 1.3 billion. If you counted one fish every single second without stopping, it would take you over 41 years just to finish counting. This was not throwing some fish in a river and hoping for the best. This was a precision operation. Each species was carefully selected. Each release site was chosen based on water temperature, flow rates, food availability, and the biological needs of that specific fish. Along with the regular fish species, nearly 1 million Chinese sturgeons were released. That ancient fish, the one that lived alongside the dinosaurs, was being given a second chance. Every single one was tagged. Every single one was tracked. And then, the scientists waited. What happened next genuinely surprised them. Within the first 2 years, researchers started seeing things they had not seen in decades. Schools of fish reappearing in stretches of river that had been silent for years. Locals walking the riverbank were noticing changes before the scientific papers were even published. The water looked different. Something alive was moving through it again. Then in early 2026, a research team published their findings. Scientists from outside China called the results the most encouraging freshwater conservation story of the past 2 decades. The total fish biomass in the river, basically the total weight of all living fish, had more than doubled in just 4 years. Not improved slightly, doubled. The number of native fish species being recorded jumped from 308 to 351. 43 species had returned to parts of the river where they had completely disappeared. Fish that locals had not seen since the 1980s were suddenly turning up in survey nets. But the story that really captured people's attention was not about fish at all. The Yangtze finless porpoise is one of the only freshwater porpoises on Earth. It does not live in the ocean. It has never lived in the ocean. It exists only in the Yangtze and nowhere else on the planet. By 2017, there were fewer than 400 of them left. Scientists tracking the population were watching a clock tick down in real time. Some models suggested functional extinction within a generation. You cannot restock a porpoise the way you can restock fish. They reproduce slowly, one calf at a time. They are sensitive to noise and pollution. Boat traffic had been injuring and stressing them for decades. These were the hardest animals to be optimistic about. But with the fishing ban in place, boat traffic dropped dramatically. Noise levels in the water fell. Pollution controls tightened. And crucially, the fish that porpoises depend on for food were coming back in large numbers thanks to the restocking program. The conditions that had made survival so brutal slowly began to improve. By 2026, the porpoise population had grown from around 400 to over 600 individuals, a 50% increase. For a species this rare and this fragile, scientists described that result as a near miracle. Locals near the river started sharing videos online of porpoises surfacing near riverbanks where they had not appeared in years. In one village, a former fisherman who had been retrained as a river monitor watched a porpoise surface near his boat early one morning. He had not seen one in over 20 years. That moment captures what this story is really about. It is not just biomass numbers and species counts and scientific papers. It is about what happens when a country decides to repair something it helped break, what it costs, and what comes back when it does. The Yangtze Project is now being studied by governments and environmental researchers around the world, not just because the results were impressive, but because of the scale and the speed. Most conservation efforts happen in small patches. A protected lake here, a seasonal limit there. The Yangtze program covered over 3,700 miles of river and its tributaries. It involved resettling hundreds of thousands of families. It required over $2.7 billion of sustained investment. and it produced measurable results within 4 years, ahead of schedule. Researchers from France, the United States, and Australia have already cited the Yangtze recovery in proposals for river restoration projects in their own countries. The data coming out of China is being used to argue for similar programs on the Mississippi, the Mekong, and struggling Amazon tributaries facing the same collapse pressures. Some species that disappeared during the worst years may never fully return. The damage done over 50 years cannot be completely undone in 10, but the direction has changed. A decline that ran for 7 decades has stopped. The curve that was pointing downward is now pointing up, and in conservation, changing the direction of a curve that has been falling for 70 years is not a small thing. It is everything. 1.3 billion fish. That was the push. And a river the world had quietly given up on is now alive again. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more stories about the technologies reshaping our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.